Because life is brief, the Bible said it was the width of a hand. There's three things I want us to see this morning that we need to do if we're going to fully live in the moment. And the first thing is, if I'm going to live in the moment, I have to create some margin in my life. I've got to create some margin in my life. There are so many things that crowd into my life that sometimes they can start to sort of steal the passion from life. And I tend to gravitate towards an overcrowded schedule. And maybe you're like that and you tend to do that too. If you don't feel like you ever have enough time in the day to get it all done, would you just raise your hand right now? Okay, look around and see everybody else is just too tired to raise their hand. Because we all, I think, struggle with this sometimes. But Jesus said in John 10:10 that I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. The abundant life he talks about. And you know how a man dealt with deal or no deal, it's kind of like that. Do you want to just exist, or do you want to really live? And God sort of lays it out there for you, deal or no deal. Do you want to exist, or do you want to really live this full, abundant life that I've promised you? But some of us never lay hold of it. We never get our arms around that abundant life because, frankly, we're just too busy. Dr. Richard Swenson talks about margin in our lives. And he says that the margin in your life is the difference between your load and your limit. The difference between the load that you're carrying and the limit of what you're able to carry. And what's in between that is margin. And we need margin in our lives. Just like it's hard to read a book if there's no space between the words and no margins around the edge of the page, it's just jumbled up and chaotic. That's the way life tends to be. We need that margin. And the less margin you have in your life, the more stress you're going to have. Most of us live our lives without really any margin. And as a result, it makes our lives chaotic and incomprehensible, just like that busy page on the book. We don't get enough rest. We don't have margin in our schedule. We don't eat right. There's no margin in our finances. We're just living paycheck to paycheck. And in life, sometimes we just need to pull over to the side of the road and just observe what the Bible talks about the Sabbath. Whether there's a day out of the week that we take to just rest, or maybe it's a Sabbath hour that I take out of my day, but we need to put a little margin in our lives. And when we do that, life starts to make sense again. Jesus modeled that for us. And in Mark 1, starting in verse 35, it says that very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." Jesus replied, "Let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That is why I have come." He knew what was most important. And if even Jesus had to be intentional about creating that space, that time for God, that margin in his life so he could be alone with the Father, how much more do we need to do that? You know, his disciples were basically telling him, "Jesus, you're disappointing people. I mean, there are women, there are children, there are sick people who have come a long way just to see you." But he knew what was most important. And he decided to separate so that he could have that time away from the crowd just to be with the Father. And if he had to do that, then we're going to have to work at it as well to create that margin. It seems like a lot of times we think, you know, if I don't have anything to show for my time, if I'm not producing a report, if I'm not making money, if I'm not fixing something, then it's been unproductive time. It's been wasted time. But the paradox, I think, is that a lot of times we have nothing tangible to show for what is truly the most productive time that we have. And that's the time that we spend with God. There's a dashboard light that's on in my van. And it would probably be a good idea for me to go see a mechanic and find out what that thing is. Because something needs to be fixed. And as we've talked about before, when we get stressed, that needs to be like a dashboard light going off in our brain to recognize that's a time that we need to get with God. We need to just turn everything off. Turn off the TVs, the radios, the engine, and just say, God, I've got 100 things to do. I don't know what's next, but one thing I know, I've got to have some time with you. We've got to have the margin in our life to be able to do that. So that instead of letting the time we spend with God be the first thing that we cut when we get busy, instead, that's the first thing that we do when we start to feel stressed. Because as we've read this week, there's enough time in your day to do everything that God wants you to do with that day. And by the same token, there's enough time in your life to do everything that God has for you to do in this life.